The day she gave birth to her fifth child, her husband leaned in close, kissed her forehead, whispered, "I love you," and walked out of the hospital. He never came back. No accident, no death, just silence, 10 years of it. Not a word, not a call, not a message, just gone. And then out of nowhere, on a quiet evening filled with nothing unusual, a knock on the door. The man who had once promised forever, who vanished like smoke, stood on her doorstep, smiling. Sometimes, the deepest kind of betrayal doesn't come with shouting, cheating, or violence. It comes in the form of abandonment. And sometimes, the pain doesn't come when they leave. It comes when they try to return. Before we dive deeper into this emotional story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Lydia was 22 when she married James. He was a year older. They weren't rich. They didn't have much. But what they did have was laughter, hope, and dreams big enough to fill a lifetime. They would stay up late talking about the kind of parents they wanted to be, the kind of home they wanted to build. Not a perfect one, but a happy one. James once said, "Let's have a house full of kids, chaos, laughter, and love. That's all I want." Lydia had smiled and nodded, "As long as we're together." They weren't afraid of struggle. They knew life would be hard, but they believed love was enough. In the early years, it was. There were money problems, sure. Rent was late sometimes, appliances broke, groceries ran out before the end of the month. But through it all, James held her hand. He'd rub her feet when she was pregnant. He'd dance with the toddlers in the living room. He'd look at her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. They had 4 kids in 6 years, and then came the 5th. The day Kira was born was cloudy. Lydia was exhausted but glowing. The birth had been hard, but the baby was healthy. James held her hand, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "I love you." Then he said he was going to get coffee from the vending machine. She nodded, eyes heavy, drifting into sleep. When she woke up, James wasn't there. She looked at the clock. An hour had passed, maybe more. She checked her phone. No message, no missed call. She waited. Another hour. A nurse walked in. Lydia asked, "Have you seen my husband?" The nurse shook her head. She called his phone. It rang and rang and rang until voicemail. She texted. No reply. She called again, straight to voicemail. The next morning, he still hadn't come back. By the time she was discharged, she had called him 37 times. She tried his email. Nothing. His social media? Empty. She even drove to his mother's house, with the newborn in a car seat, her body aching from labor. His mother looked confused. "James, I thought he was with you." He wasn't. That night, Lydia sat on the edge of her bed, 5 children asleep around her, and she cried. Not the kind of cry that makes noise, the kind where your soul feels like it's tearing apart, but your mouth stays closed because you don't even know how to scream anymore. The days that followed were chaos. Kira cried at night. So did Lydia. The other 4 kids didn't understand what was happening. They thought Daddy had just gone to work, that he'd be back with toys or snacks or pizza. But James never came. The bills kept arriving. The rent was due. The fridge was half empty. Lydia had just enough maternity leave to buy herself a few weeks, but not enough to buy peace. She found a job, then a second one. She'd wake up before sunrise, dress the kids in the quiet darkness, and gently pack their lunch with food that barely stretched from the week before. Sometimes she'd skip breakfast so they wouldn't have to. She'd drop them off at school and daycare, put on a smile, and head straight to her first shift at the grocery store, then the second shift at the local diner. Back to back, on her feet all day, smiling for customers, pretending everything was okay. She'd get home just before bedtime, read to them, check homework with tired eyes, kiss their foreheads and tuck them in. Then she'd sit on the bathroom floor, close the door, and cry, quietly, because if they heard her, they'd worry. And they were just kids. She had to be strong. But some nights she couldn't even pretend. Some nights she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, asking herself questions that never had answers. Why did he leave? Was it her fault? Was she not enough? Was 5 kids too much? Had he been planning to leave all along? She tried to hate him. She really did. But what she mostly felt was emptiness, a strange, sharp kind of grief. Not the kind that comes from death, but from being left behind with no explanation. the kind of grief that reopens itself again and again, like a wound that never scabs over. The months turned into years, and Lydia learned to live with the ache. It was no longer a sharp pain. It was dull now, constant, like background noise in her chest. Some days she didn't even notice it until something small reminded her. A song on the radio, the smell of James's favorite soap, a joke her son told that sounded just like him. There were days she felt like she was floating, just surviving, not living, waking up because she had to, smiling because they needed her to, holding it together for the sake of 5 little hearts who still believed in magic, even after the world had broken her. She worked long hours. Sometimes she'd fall asleep on the bus ride home, her neck bent awkwardly against the window, her body aching from standing all day. She missed her stop once, walked a mile back home in the dark, didn't even cry, just kept walking. She couldn't afford to break down. Not when the rent was late again. Not when the fridge held only eggs and a half carton of milk. Not when the twins had grown out of their shoes and Kira needed a winter jacket. She'd come home, kiss the kids, check their homework, sit with them during dinner, even though she wasn't hungry. She didn't want them to know. She didn't want them to feel like they were a burden. They were never the burden. They were the only reason she kept going, the only thing keeping her from giving up. Sometimes when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, she'd step into the shower and just stand there, let the water run, and cry. No sobbing, no gasping, just warm water and silent tears sliding down her face. It was the only time she allowed herself to fall apart. Afterward, she'd dry off, wrap herself in her robe, and tiptoe into her room. She'd pull out the drawer beside her bed, the one she never opened in front of the kids, and take out a single photograph, her wedding picture. It was faded now, the edges curling, but she stared at it anyway. There they were, her and James, young, laughing, holding hands, not a single clue of the storm ahead. She stared at his smile like it could give her answers, but it never did. After a few minutes, she'd slip the photo back into the drawer and shut it softly. Narration. In front of her kids, she smiled, but every night, the silence screamed louder. She tried to hate him. But how do you hate someone who once looked at you like you were the only thing that mattered? How do you unlove the father of your children? How do you let go of a promise that was never supposed to be broken? These were the questions she wrestled with at night, alone in a room filled with shadows and regrets. The kids didn't talk about him at first. For a long time, they didn't even ask. Maybe they sensed something. Maybe they saw the pain in her eyes every time his name was mentioned. But eventually, they started to wonder. Aaron was the first. He was 8 when he asked. They were watching cartoons one Saturday morning, sitting on the floor, cereal bowls in their laps. A character in the show ran into his father's arms. Everyone cheered. Aaron turned to Lydia, his voice small, curious. "Mom, where is Dad?" Lydia froze. The spoon in her hand trembled. Aaron continued, "When's he coming back?" Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears at bay. Aaron stared at her with eyes too innocent to understand abandonment, too young to carry disappointment. She forced a smile, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "Soon, baby. He'll be back soon." Narration. She knew it was a lie, but how do you explain abandonment to a child? How do you say he walked out on us? How do you say, I don't know if he's dead or alive? How do you tell your son, who looks just like the man who left you, that maybe Daddy just didn't care enough to stay? You don't. You lie. You keep lying until the lie starts to hurt more than the truth. She kissed the top of Aaron's head and stood up quickly, walking to the kitchen before the tears spilled over. She cried quietly while washing dishes. Later that night, she wrote a letter to James, one she never planned to send. Just to get the words out. I hate you for leaving. I hate you for breaking me. But I hate myself more for still hoping you'll come back. She folded the letter, placed it under her pillow, and slept beside it like it was the last piece of him she had left. And yet, even through all the heartbreak, Lydia never gave up on being a mother. She never let her pain seep into her children's lives. At school events, she showed up early. She clapped the loudest. She took pictures. She packed lunches with notes that said, "You're amazing. I'm proud of you." When Smith fell off his bike and scraped his knee, she was there in seconds, kissing his forehead and saying, You're so brave." When Eva came home crying because a teacher said she was too loud, Lydia told her, "Your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She did everything, every little thing, to make her children feel like they were enough, even if she didn't always feel that way herself. Because at the end of the day, she wasn't just raising 5 kids. She was trying to raise 5 hearts that had been born into a world where their father had chosen to disappear. And that was her hardest job of all. It was a Thursday afternoon when Smith came home with his shoulders hunched and his eyes unusually red. He didn't say anything at first, just walked in, dropped his backpack, and went straight to the living room, curling up on the couch. Lydia noticed immediately. He wasn't a quiet boy. He usually came home humming tunes or sharing something funny from school, but that day he didn't even take off his shoes. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat beside him. "Smith?" she asked gently. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer right away. His little fingers picked at the hem of his sleeve. His lips were pressed tight like he was trying not to cry. Finally, without looking up, he whispered, "They laughed at me." Lydia's heart dropped. "Who did, baby?" "My friends. In class. We were doing a project about families. Everyone was talking about their dads, what they do, what they're like. And then they asked me." He paused, his voice starting to shake. "They said I never talk about my dad, so I told them I don't really know him." A tear slid down his cheek. "They laughed, Mom. They laughed because I couldn't say anything about my dad." He looked up at her then, eyes wide, searching for something she wasn't sure she could give. She wanted to protect him from everything. But this was different. She pulled him close, holding his small body tightly against her chest. She didn't speak. She couldn't. What could she possibly say? She was his mother. She could fight bullies. She could fight bills. She could fight sleep and exhaustion and pain. But how do you fight in absence? How do you defend someone who isn't there? How do you help your child make sense of a father-shaped hole? That night, after the kids went to bed, Lydia sat in the hallway just outside their rooms, listening to their soft breathing, her back against the wall. She stared at the ceiling, her arms wrapped around her knees, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't cry. She was too numb. Something inside her had shifted. A quiet, final breaking point. The hope she'd clung to for nearly a decade was beginning to fade. The weeks that followed moved quietly. Something had changed, not just in Lydia, but in the atmosphere of their home. There was a calm that hadn't been there before. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of acceptance, an understanding that the life they had was the life they would continue living, with or without James. Lydia found herself laughing more, not because she was happy, but because the weight on her chest wasn't as heavy anymore. Her laugh sounded real again, even if only for a few seconds at a time. She started taking the kids to the park again. They ate dinner without that unspoken question hanging over the table, the question no one dared to voice. Is Dad ever coming back? The younger ones, like Kira, still asked from time to time. She'd point at drawings she made and say, "I want to show Daddy this one." Lydia would smile and nod, never knowing what to say. But the older ones, especially Aaron and Ryan, they no longer asked. They had grown past the wondering phase, past the longing. Their silence now was louder than words. And Lydia noticed. They had built their own rhythm. Aaron helped with homework. Ryan folded the laundry. Eva packed her own lunch. Smith had started reading to Kira before bed. Without even realizing it, Lydia had raised children who knew how to survive. Children who loved each other fiercely. Children who didn't need saving. They just needed someone to stand beside them. One evening, while clearing out a box from the closet, Lydia came across something unexpected. James's old notebook, tucked between a pair of long-forgotten coats. She sat on the edge of her bed, fingers gently turning the worn pages. There were sketches in it. James used to doodle. Silly little drawings of him and Lydia, or pictures of the kids playing in imagined scenes. One drawing was of the entire family, sitting on a picnic blanket under a tree. Everyone was smiling. She stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, she closed the notebook, placed it in the box, and slid it back into the closet. She wasn't ready to throw it out, but she didn't want it close either. That night, as Lydia stood by the kitchen sink washing dishes, she looked through the window into the backyard. The kids were chasing fireflies, laughing, living, No one mentioned James anymore. And maybe that was its own kind of healing. It had been 10 years. 10 long years of silence. No phone call, no letter, no trace of the man who had once held her hand in the delivery room and whispered, "I love you." 10 years of unanswered questions. And then, just like that, an email. It came on a quiet afternoon. Lydia had just put a pot of rice on the stove. The kids were upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table with her old laptop, checking bills and work schedules, and she saw it. A message in her inbox. No subject, no sender name, just a string of unfamiliar numbers. Curious, she clicked it. 12 words. That's all it said. "I miss you and the kids. I know I left. I can explain." Lydia froze. Her hands trembled on the keyboard. She read it again and again, trying to make sense of it. It had no greeting, no name, no explanation, just those words. 12 words that felt like a scream inside a whisper. She stared at the screen for a long time, so long that the rice on the stove began to boil over. Then, with a sharp breath, she slammed the laptop shut. Her heart was pounding, not in anger, not even in sadness. It was something else. Fear, confusion, rage, grief, all mixing together in a way that made her feel dizzy. She stood up, walked to the sink, and splashed cold water on her face. She wanted to scream, she wanted to cry, but most of all, she wanted to pretend it never happened. And so, she reopened the laptop, and she deleted the message. No reply, no second read, just gone. She closed the computer, locked it in the drawer, and stood in silence, listening to the laughter of her children upstairs, and she whispered to herself, "Not now, not ever." 1 week later, just as the strange email began to fade from her mind, something worse happened. It started with a cough, then a fever, then vomiting. Kira, now 10 years old, usually bounced back from colds quickly, but this time it was different. She looked pale, her eyes were tired, her tiny hands felt like fire against Lydia's skin. Lydia gave her medicine, tried to stay calm, but by the third day, Kira wasn't waking up easily. She was barely eating, and then in the middle of the night, her breathing changed. It became shallow, ragged. Lydia didn't hesitate. She wrapped her daughter in a blanket, shouted for Aaron to watch the others, and drove straight to the emergency room, still in her house slippers and robe. The hospital lights were harsh and cold. Doctors rushed Kira in. Nurses asked questions Lydia didn't know how to answer. Her heart felt like it was caught in a vice. After what felt like hours, a doctor approached her. He was kind, calm, but his words pierced her chest like glass. "The treatment is expensive," he said gently. "We need payment up front before we can proceed." Lydia stared at him, stunned. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Please, please save my daughter. I'll find a way. I swear I will." The doctor nodded, but his expression didn't change. They needed money, more than she had, more than she could gather quickly. She clutched her purse, hands trembling, and pulled out everything she had, cash, even a checkbook with an overdrafted account. It still wasn't enough. She dropped to her knees in the waiting room, the weight of 10 years of pain crashing over her like a wave. Tears ran down her cheeks, not loud, just steady. And all she could whisper was, "Please, please, help her." And somehow, someone did. Lydia didn't sleep that night. She sat in a stiff hospital chair beside Kira's bed, clutching her hand, whispering soft prayers and promises into the air. Desperate, broken sentences only a mother could understand. "Just stay with me, baby girl. Please. I'll figure it out. I always do." The machines beeped steadily beside them, counting heartbeats, measuring breaths. It was almost dawn when the doctor returned. His expression was calm, just as it was before. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. A shift. He approached slowly. "Miss Lawson," he said gently. Lydia stood up immediately, tightening the blanket around her shoulders. "Yes, please, is she okay?" "She's stable," he said with a small nod. "She's responding to fluids, and we've begun treatment." Lydia blinked, confused. But I didn't pay. I told you I—" The doctor held up a hand softly. "It's been taken care of." "What?" Her voice cracked. "Your hospital bill," he continued. "It was fully covered about an hour ago. A man came in, said he was your husband." Lydia stood frozen. The room spun. She stared at the doctor as if he had just spoken a foreign language. "My husband?" she repeated, barely above a whisper. Her legs felt unsteady. "I don't have a husband," she muttered. The doctor looked uncertain, but he gave a respectful nod and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. Lydia turned and looked at Kira, still asleep, still hooked up to tubes, and suddenly her mind flew back. That email, 12 words. I miss you and the kids. I know I left. I can explain. She had deleted it, thrown it away like it didn't matter. But now, she couldn't ignore the weight behind those words. The question circled her mind like a bird trapped in a room with no windows. She didn't want to believe it, because believing it meant confronting a pain she had carefully wrapped up and buried. But she couldn't stop thinking, couldn't stop feeling. Why now? Why Kira? And what did he want? A week passed. Kira came home. She was weak but better, smiling again, resting a lot. The house returned to a kind of fragile peace. The kids knew something had happened, something serious, but Lydia hadn't told them everything. Not yet. And then it happened. It was a Sunday afternoon. The house was warm. The air smelled of cinnamon. Lydia had baked a tray of muffins as a small treat. She was in the kitchen, drying dishes, her thoughts half lost in worry and half in relief that Kira was safe. And then a knock at the door. Just once. Then again. She barely noticed at first. It was Aaron who opened it. He expected a neighbor, a delivery, anything but what he saw. There, standing just outside the door, was a man, wearing an old jacket, his hair longer, his face aged, but unmistakably, it was him. "Please, is Lydia home?" the man asked softly. Aaron blinked. Who are you?" Before the man could answer, Lydia stepped into the hallway, drying her hands on a towel. She looked up casually, and her entire body stopped. The towel fell from her fingers. The breath left her lungs. The plate she was holding slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "James?" She took a step forward, then stepped back, disoriented. Her knees trembled. James stood still, eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Guilt, regret, fear. She shook her head slowly, her voice rising, breaking. You're a monster." James opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. Don't you say anything." He lowered his gaze. Lydia's voice shook, but she didn't hold back. "You left me in a hospital bed. You kissed me goodbye and never came back. Not a word, not a reason, just gone." She took a breath, sharp, painful. "You let your son get laughed at in school for not having a father. You let your daughter almost die without knowing her own blood type. You let me break alone." Her voice cracked again. "I carried your children. I raised them alone. I held them when they cried. I went without so they wouldn't. I held our lives together with shaking hands." James swallowed hard. "Lydia, please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm here now. I want to see the kids. I want to explain." She stared at him. Her lips parted, then closed again. For a moment, the silence between them was thick, filled with everything that had never been said. Then she stepped forward, and slowly, without saying a word, she closed the door. Not with a slam. Just quietly, deliberately. She pressed her back against it and slid down to the floor, her hands over her face, the tears finally breaking through. 10 years ago, he left without warning. Now he returned without permission. But not every door that closes stays shut out of anger. Some doors close just to keep the healing in. Aaron stood in the hallway watching her, unsure of what he'd just seen, unsure of who that man was. Lydia wiped her face. She looked up at her son. "It's nothing to worry about, baby," she said softly. "I need to talk to you all tomorrow, okay?" Aaron nodded slowly, but the worry didn't leave his face. And Lydia sat there a little longer, letting her body feel what it hadn't allowed itself to feel in 10 long years. Everything. The next morning the house was quiet, too quiet. Lydia stood by the kitchen window, staring at nothing in particular. She had barely slept. Her mind was heavy, her chest even heavier. She had spent the entire night replaying his face, his voice, his apology that never really sounded like one. She knew she couldn't keep it from them anymore. They had the right to know. She called everyone into the living room. The kids gathered, half curious, half concerned. Kira curled up beside her with sleepy eyes. Aaron stood near the doorway, arms folded. Ryan sat on the floor, legs crossed. Eva and Smith leaned against each other on the couch. She looked at each of them, one by one. Then, with a deep breath, she said it. "Your dad is back." The room went still. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed felt louder than words. Aaron was the first to react. His eyebrows pulled together, lips tight. "Why now?" he asked. Lydia's heart dropped. Ryan didn't even look at her. He just stared ahead, his voice calm but cutting. "We're fine without him." Lydia nodded slowly. I know, she said softly, and you're allowed to feel however you feel. She paused. You don't have to see him, not if you don't want to. You're in control now. You get to decide. No one responded. The kids exchanged glances, but the decision hung in the air like smoke. Later that evening, Aaron quietly said, maybe we should hear what he has to say. They agreed to meet at a small restaurant on the edge of town. It was quiet, tucked into a corner where no one really went. Lydia chose the place on purpose, neutral ground, no memories. The kids walked in first. Lydia followed behind them, her eyes scanning the room. Then she saw him. James. He was already there, sitting nervously at a corner table. He stood up as they approached, smoothing his shirt and offering a small, unsure smile. Wow, he said, his voice trembling. You've all gotten so big. I almost didn't recognize you, Aaron. No one replied. They sat down in silence. James chuckled awkwardly, rubbing his hands together. I missed you all so much. Still, no one spoke. He cleared his throat. I know this is hard, and I don't expect anything from you, but I want to tell you the truth. You deserve that much. He looked down, then back up again, eyes wet, voice low. When Kira was born, I was already in trouble. Financially, emotionally. I was desperate. I made a mistake, a big one. I borrowed money from the wrong people, dangerous people. He paused, letting the words sink in. They started threatening me, the house, you. I didn't know what to do. I thought, if I left, they'd stop. I thought disappearing would keep you safe. He looked at them, pleading. I didn't stop loving you. I panicked. I was scared. Aaron leaned forward slightly, his voice sharper now. So for 10 years you were scared? James nodded slowly. And in all those 10 years, Aaron continued, you couldn't check in? Not once? A letter? A message? Anything? James looked down. I wanted to, but I didn't know if it was safe. Ryan's voice cut in. It was colder than Aaron's, more restrained. Do you even love us? James looked up quickly. Of course I do. Ryan's jaw tightened. We thought you were dead, or worse, we thought you just didn't care. James looked like he'd been slapped. He opened his mouth to speak, but Lydia interrupted, her voice firm, steady. You paid Kira's hospital bill, thank you. James gave a small, hopeful nod. But don't mistake that for forgiveness, she said. The hope faded from his face. I want my family back, James said quietly. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to make things right. Lydia held his gaze. Then prove it. The silence returned, but it didn't last long. Aaron stood up, then Ryan, then Eva, Smith, and Kira followed, each slowly rising from their seats without a word. They didn't cry, they didn't scream. They just stood and walked away. Lydia hesitated for a moment. She looked at James one last time. He looked small in that chair, alone. She turned and followed her children out the door. She waited 10 years for an apology. She imagined it in 100 different ways, through letters, through phone calls, even in tears at the front door. But when it finally came, she realized something she never expected. She no longer needed it. Life didn't stop after James came back. It didn't pause for his regrets or rewind for his explanations. It moved forward, and so did Lydia. There were no grand declarations, no speeches, just quiet choices that slowly changed the course of her life. The day after the restaurant meeting, Lydia sat in the break room at work, staring at a printed flyer posted on the corkboard. Team lead position available, apply within. She hesitated for a moment. Then, with a steady breath, she tore off the slip at the bottom and put it in her purse. A week later, she sat across from her manager, not shaking, not apologizing for her ambition, but speaking clearly about why she was ready. And she got the job. More hours, better pay, more control. She walked out of the office that day with her chin slightly higher, not because someone gave her power, but because she finally decided to claim it. Back at home, Aaron, who had grown into a quiet leader in the house, had started something of his own. He noticed how some kids in his school struggled with math and reading. Kids like Smith had once struggled, so Aaron started a small after-school tutoring group. Just a few kids at first, then more. Teachers praised him. Younger kids looked up to him. He never said it out loud, but deep down he was trying to be the man he wished he'd had. Kira was healing too. Her laugh was returning. Her drawings filled the fridge again. Sometimes she asked questions about James, but they didn't sting like they used to. Lydia answered carefully, gently, truthfully. They were moving forward, and it was beautiful to watch. But James wasn't done. At first, it was a bouquet of lilies delivered to their doorstep. No card, no note, just flowers. Then came a small box, inside it a tiny necklace with Kira's birthstone. Then letters, one for each child, long, handwritten apologies folded neatly into white envelopes. Lydia found them all in the mailbox one morning. She placed them on the kitchen table and stared at them for a long time. Then she gathered them in a drawer, not out of anger, out of peace. James sent messages too, emails filled with reflections, memories, reasons, some long, some short. One simply said, "Tell Aaron I'm proud of him. I heard about the tutoring program." Lydia read them. She always read them. But she never responded, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't owe him the closure he was looking for. He tried to come back into a story that had already turned its final page. And no matter how many flowers he sent, he couldn't rewrite the chapter where he disappeared. The children knew about the gifts. They saw the letters. They chose not to open them, not out of spite, but out of quiet strength. James had become a shadow, no longer a storm, just a faint outline in the distance. Lydia still cried sometimes, but not because she missed him. She cried for the version of herself who waited by the door every night, for the woman who blamed herself, who begged for answers, who thought she wasn't enough. That woman no longer lived in her reflection. Now there was someone new, someone steady, someone free. What about you? If you were in Lydia's shoes, what would you do? Would you forgive James after everything? Would you open the door and give him another chance? Or would you close that chapter for good and keep moving forward without looking back? Let us know in the comments. We're reading every single one. And if this story moved you in any way, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Humanity Stories for more powerful, emotional stories just like this one. Until next time, take care of your heart.